Well, hey, micro friends. It's Friday. I guess it's the last day of on-campus, in-person stuff. Doesn't make a difference. I'm going to be, when we get back from Thanksgiving break, I'm going to continue discussion and we'll continue talking. But we've been going over viruses, and now we're going to look at viruses of the circulatory and nervous system. One of the key things to keep in mind with viruses is they can only attack the cells that they have a receptor ligand interaction with. So, just as an example, the coronavirus, COVID-19, has a spike protein that binds to the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor that is present on the cells of the upper respiratory tract in the lungs. And so how a virus binds, or the cell types that the virus binds, are going to determine a lot about what that virus is going to do. So to wit, we have the virus that causes AIDS, the virus known as the human immunodeficiency virus. And it generates a disease, manifests itself as something called acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So it was first reported in the CDC in 1981, and young men, otherwise healthy, were coming down with some strange kinds of symptoms. Things like oral candidiasis, which is a yeast infection, pneumonias caused by viruses, kidney issues. One of the specific things was something called Kaposi sarcoma, which the CDC prior to 81 had seen like 3 or 4 cases of. And it's because this is a cancer, a tumor, that the immune system is really good at identifying and pulling out. And so these are young men that are showing symptoms of having compromised immune systems. And in 83, the virus was named, the virus was identified, and it was finally purified and named in 86. And there's actually a whole really cool story about the discovery of the virus and the competition between a French group and the U.S. group, hoping to be able to identify a vaccine for it as a money-making possibility, and so far we still don't have a vaccine to it. So the virus is a retrovirus, meaning that it is an RNA virus, and it binds to the T lymphocytes, the T4 cells, and that's because they have a receptor that interacts with the virus. So worldwide distribution is, actually all over, and particularly rough in southern Africa, but it's around pretty high in China. The total 33 million, the bulk of them, 67%, are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is a serious issue. The disease stages run like this, in which you have the primary infection, and it's really a very mild thing. You don't really have much going on. Low-grade fever, a little bit of a flu, short duration. And then there can be a latent period. You can be essentially asymptomatic for quite a while, up to 15 years or so, and then eventually the T helper cell count drops sufficiently. This is a sign of the immune system beginning to crash, and all these different opportunistic infections begin, and this eventually leads to death if it's not treated. Now, there are a couple of different spots in the life cycle that are subject to treatment. So the virus binds to the receptor on the T cells. The virus then is uncoated, and the RNA is brought into the cell. The RNA produces a protein known as reverse transcriptase that's able to take an RNA molecule and turn it into a DNA molecule, double-stranded DNA molecule. That then gets into the host's genome, and it integrates into the genome. The genome then can turn that virus back on and begin producing the RNA genome of the virus. Rather clever. It gets assembled, and then it buds and is released. So this is a coded virus. There are a number of ways that HIV is able to actually maintain itself in that there are mutations that can happen that can allow it to invade or evade the immune response. And this allows for the virus to continue growing and continue infecting the cells. And additionally, you begin to actually reduce the number of T cells that are needed for fighting viruses. So it's a fairly nasty little creature here. There are, HIV actually sort of assisted in developing a range of antiviral agents. And so there's a drug cocktail now that is used to prevent the replication of HIV. And so people that are infected with it, they remain infected. As it turns out, HIV, the virus, is able to sort of go into hiding in different parts of the body, in some of the nervous system and different organs. But it can be essentially kept at bay, and the T cell population can grow back up by the use of antiretroviral or by antivirals. Let's see. There are things that will inhibit the integration of the double-stranded DNA. There are nucleotide analogs that are able to inhibit reverse transcriptase, the reverse transcription. One is called dideoxyribonucleic, and it turns out that the polymerase, the reverse transcriptase, is a DNA polymerase, is less, what's the term I'm thinking about, stringent about what kind of nucleotides it'll pull in, and it'll pull stuff in that the normal DNA polymerase won't pull in, so the side effects are not dreadful. You're not inhibiting the production of your own DNA. There are drugs that can inhibit the binding, drugs that are inhibiting the processing of the protein once it gets into the cell, things like proteases and things. And so there are ways to treat this, but there really is no way to prevent it other than this kind of treatment. So why now is actually a good question. Increased human interaction with animals. Chimpanzees are a source of one of the viruses. And increased poverty leads to prostitution, which is the main cause of the spread in Africa, particularly where there is no condom use, or condom use is viewed as being something culturally negative. So it is also a slow disease in its development, and that means that it can spread because people are asymptomatic. Let's talk about herpes again. We've been talking about herpes a bit. So the different kinds of herpes viruses are around. Beta herpes infects the T lymphocytes, and it causes mononucleosis. So this is one of the herpes virus types that is something you perhaps are familiar with. The other herpes viruses are remaining in B lymphocytes, and things like Epstein-Barr virus, these are able to cause leukemias and lymphomas of B cells. They're not direct, but they can lead to it. Kaposi sarcoma, this is one that folks that have HIV can't knock out, but a good immune system can. This is also caused by another kind of herpes virus. All right, hepatitis virus is manifesting itself as liver disease. There are a number of different viruses, but they all affect the liver. And the term hepatitis virus is widespread, and it's not any single kind of viral class. We've got Hep A, which is a naked RNA virus, similar actually to some of the cold viruses. Hep C is sort of the newer thing. It's an enveloped icosahedral RNA virus. Let's see, then Hep B is enveloped. This is a DNA virus, and this can often cause acute cirrhosis of the liver. And this is what's passed through bodily fluids. Hep B is what is most concerned in terms of casual infection. So if you share a drink with somebody, or if a food worker is infected with hepatitis B, they can begin passing it on. Hep D is actually kind of an odd one. It's transmitted as a co-infection. It actually requires other viruses in order for it to be infective. So the hepatitis life cycle for HBV, the virus is brought into the cell through this mechanism known as endocytosis, where the membrane gathers around it, and that puts a double membrane around it. It is found then in a vesicle. It's released, and then the genome gets into the nucleus, where it's actually able to undergo integration and production and proliferation of the genome itself. And then the RNA is being processed and assembled, and then starts to be dumped back out. So this is a fairly complicated life cycle, and I don't know, it's pretty cool. I'm not going to ask you anything about this specifically on the exam, though, but something to know. So the course of the hepatitis, very often infection can be via contaminated body fluids. So IV drug use, needle sticks, accidental, contaminated transfusion, fluid in the wounds, and it travels by the blood to the liver, where it replicates. This is where the receptors are. Symptoms start to show up after about a month or so, and you got a couple of different outcomes. You can essentially cure it by your immune system clearing it in a few months. The virus is gone. You can have an acute infection that is 95% of the cases, where you have this moment and then you're able to clear it. Chronic infection occurs in a pretty low number, around 5% or so, and the virus continues low grade in the liver, and this long-term inflammation is going to cause liver damage and liver cancers. So other kinds of viruses that get into the blood are not being brought in by wounds or IV needles or through sexual transmission, but they're actually born through vectors, much in the way we talked about some of the bacteria and things that are vector-borne. There are a number of what are known as hemorrhagic diseases. These cause extreme bleeding, connective tissue damages, allow you to leak, and you also can have a drop in the clotting factors. Platelets are dropping. Mosquitoes tend to be the most common vector. They also serve as a reservoir. Other reservoirs end up being mammals, primates, you and I. Some have reservoirs like West Nile virus, end up being in birds. So you may have it, the virus, but if you don't have the vector, if you don't have that specific mosquito around, then it can't be transmitted very well. A lot of diseases originating in Africa, probably due to very sort of habitat invasion. Global warming is a concern for this because mosquitoes that typically don't survive in moderate winters, if the winters start to warm up, mosquitoes that are found in the south, like the mosquito that is involved in the Zika virus transmission, start making their way further up north. So at this point, the mosquito that carries the Zika virus, it's a very specific species of mosquito, is not much further north than St. Louis latitude. But as we start to warm up, that mosquito population can slowly start moving up and heading up further and further north. So this is a mosquito-transmitted virus known, that produces something called dengue fever. And it's very common in the tropics. So dengue fever, yellow fever, these are different kinds of strains of the virus that are brought through the mosquito. You end up with a headache, muscle aches, back pain. You have a sort of progression first you have a pretty high fever, and then depending, that can shift into this hemorrhagic fever, in which you have profuse bleeding as the platelet count begins to drop. This can result then further in dengue shock syndrome, where you have very low blood pressure and a pretty high mortality. So there's no vaccine and no treatment. It is something you have to be careful about in the tropics, that you don't get bitten by mosquitoes. Why mosquito netting is useful. So it's a pretty serious killer. Yellow fever is another one of these kinds of viruses. So with yellow fever, though, we do have an effective vaccine. There isn't a treatment, but it is something we have a vaccine for. It is found in temperate climates, so it actually can be found in southern U.S. It actually ended up having a significant effect on the production of the development of the Panama Canal, and a very potent insecticide known as DDT, which is no longer used, was credited with actually being able to allow the workers to actually build the Panama Canal, because they would wipe out the mosquitoes. Turns out that it's not all that effective over the long term, but that's part of what good insect pest management is all about. So things like making sure that you don't have open water, making sure that, things like in tires and stuff, that good hygiene in terms of keeping up with a leaf litter and stuff, and wearing insect repellent, or at nighttime having mosquito netting. These are all critical things. Another virus that we just mentioned here that is been in the news for a while now, not so much lately, the coronavirus taking over, is the Zika virus. And this is carried specifically by a mosquito known as Aedes aegypti. And this mosquito also can spread, or this virus can also be spread as a sexually transmitted disease in various bodily fluids. So there are incidents of the mosquito, but the virus in the U.S. Has not been seen much. So there's no deaths. It's not all that serious until evidence then arose of birth defects. And this has resulted in Brazil in a phenomenon known as microcephaly, which is a abnormally developed brain and skull. So, another virus known as Bunya virus. This is a RNA virus, and viruses in this category that you perhaps have heard of are the hantavirus, which is passed from mouse urine. Don't let no mice pee on you. The other form of it is also known as sandfly fever. That's in Asia and Central America. It also can be carried by a mosquito. So, hantavirus was back in the mid-90s, actually, a bit of an issue in the Southwest, and even up as into the Dakotas, but in the plain states. There is not an insect vector. Rather, it's airborne from dried rodent pee. So it is not too serious. You can generate fever, nausea, pain, respiratory issues that then can further develop into bleeding and kidney problems. Hemorrhagic fever, which, just as you know, is a general catch-all term. Like you have a cold, it is caused by a variety of viruses. Hemorrhagic fever is this leaking phenomenon that is resulting from platelet being too low, and that's caused by a variety of different viruses. There is the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome that can begin to have a pretty high mortality as well. So, a couple other sorts of things like Rift Valley fever, primarily in Africa. It's mild, but it can progress to liver damage. there are occasional epidemics of it. There is no vaccine for it. The chikungunya virus, or CHIKV, is a mosquito-borne virus that has been primarily in the tropics. And so you can see sort of in this equatorial region, this is where it really is primarily found. So most infections are subclinical, not any kind of real phenomenon. But you can have long-term effects as well. So there are a lot of viruses out there, and if they don't end up in major metropolitan areas, you may never hear about them. Other viruses that perhaps you've heard of, the Ebola virus and the Marburg virus or the Zaire virus. These are viruses that are producing really ugly hemorrhagic symptoms, massive bleeding. They have a very rapid onset with fever and rash, leading to vomiting, diarrhea. Blood vessels begin to open up and lose their ability to maintain their structure. Leads to massive blood loss and massive bleeding. Mortality can be very, very high. With Ebola virus, it's approaching 90%. So Ebola is limited pretty much to parts of Africa. Now, this is an RNA virus. It's actually got this little weird curly shape to it. The RNA is tucked in here with a protein coat around it. And Ebola is an interesting kind of problem. Frankly, I'm jumping pages because I don't like to look at that guy's face. Ebola is so rapid in its onset that people don't really have a chance to move around much. And so unlike the current coronavirus, you don't end up with asymptomatic people that are moving about, or people that have the sniffles and don't think as much. If you get Ebola, you pretty much are going to be stuck. And so it tends to flare up in these little hot spots, and then it'll just die back because you don't really have a way for the virus to spread. Let's see. So an arenavirus is a very oddball irregular strand virus. It is generating a couple of different viral parts. The RNA is then being used to direct the production of specific proteins, and there's a couple of different RNAs in it. Again, just sort of an oddball thing. Another African kind of virus called Lassa fever, found in Western Africa. Again, this is like the hantavirus in that it is inhaled through powder and dust that's contaminated with mouse urine. No vaccine, no treatment, primarily rodent control prevention is what we have to do. Let's see. So vector-borne viruses, as we've been covering some, mostly are through mosquitoes, things like malaria. West Nile virus, St. Louis encephalitis virus, Western equine encephalitis, Eastern equine, different kinds of viruses that have a horse-mosquito-host interaction, and they can get into us. These are some of the new viruses that are emerging from the tropics. Typically, you have a bird host. The mosquito picks it up from the bird and then transmits it on to a human. The viruses typically don't produce anything too serious. You can have aches, neck pain, and fever. It can result in meningitis or encephalitis infection and swelling of the brain and the central nervous system, leading then to some real serious issues of convulsions and coma. They're not too dangerous, though. So let's just finish up then with some nervous system viruses. A couple of interesting guys. One you've heard of is the rabies virus. So this is a virus. It's sort of it's got an RNA virus. It's a minus-strand RNA virus, and it's able to infect pretty much all mammals. So in humans, it's rarely passed human to human. Most of the common vectors are things like a bite from an infected animal, a bat, raccoons, skunks, dogs particularly, but there is a good vaccine for it that can prevent it from being found in dogs and then prevent it from being picked up by humans. So the animal vaccine is very effective, and so that's why pets are required to be inoculated. And so what you have to be thoughtful of is salivating or stumbling around vicious animals, daytime appearance of normally nocturnal animals, good sign not to go near those guys. So when the victim is bit, the virus is shed in the saliva, and it enters into the muscles. It is going to replicate fairly slowly, and so it can take quite a while before symptoms begin to show up. It then begins to get into the peripheral neurons, and then from there it begins making its way up to the central nervous system. And this is where the encephalitis and brain and central nervous system inflammation become apparent, and that is where you pretty much have reached the point of no return. So at this point, you have altered mood. The animal becomes very cranky, very aggressive, excess saliva and tearing, which is a way of spreading the virus. So the coma then leads primarily death due to anoxia, the inability to breathe. So a interesting story here is this young woman was bitten by a bat on a picnic, and she began to show symptoms around a month later. So there's something that is known as the Milwaukee, not the city, but a different name, protocol, and it is used to slow viral replication. So you induce the coma, you chill the body, you have antivirals, and you look to see if you can't begin allowing the immune system to start generating antibodies against the virus and give the body long enough to get the immune system up without actually ending up with the virus getting into the brain and killing you. The recovery is very slow. There is some neuronal damage with Jenna. It is not a particularly successful treatment, around 8% success, so it's actually quite controversial, particularly in that it does cause severe damage, but rather than death. So, she has survived, but rabies actually is a very serious kind of issue. Hey, another virus that perhaps you've heard of is the polio virus. And polio used to be a really serious infection. And most folks recover without any kind of effect, but it can lead to meningitis, to infection of the brain and inflammation. That can lead to peripheral paralysis, and it can even get into paralysis of the diaphragm, so you have inability to breathe, and that would lead to death, to suffocation, unless you have some kind of respirator system. And so post-polio syndrome is often exhibited with peripheral weakness in the lower trunk and the legs, muscle atrophy. Decades later it can happen. And so it is a oral fecal type of poor sanitation thing that leads to polio, but it can happen. So there is now a very effective polio vaccine. This is one of the very first vaccines to be developed. And Jonas Salk developed a viral vaccine in which he took a polio virus, and they were able to kill it by heating it up, and that was able to demonstrate and generate an effective immune response. And then the Sabin virus was the live virus, but it is an attenuated, mutated virus that essentially has no symptoms and is somewhat replication defective, or at least not able to replicate very well. And you would administer that like on a sugar cube. And this was a pretty effective vaccine, both these were. And it essentially eliminated polio. So we typically don't have the polio virus around much anymore, and people don't typically take the vaccine for it. So polio is beginning to come back as different parts of the world don't have effective vaccinations ongoing, but it is a reasonably controlled kind of virus. All right, so part of what this is indicating is that the vaccine for the coronavirus is a really important thing involved in being able to slow and hopefully stop the spread of COVID-19. And part of this interesting story is that vaccines get developed for viruses that hit specific, primarily, I would imagine, northern and more affluent societies. And so we have a variety of viruses that don't have vaccines, and that's a shame because now, and potentially with the new advances in RNA viruses, the fact that you can make an RNA against a viral protein fairly easily and use this as a vaccine, this may actually lead to an increased level of vaccinations on a whole range of different kinds of viruses. Well, that's what I have to say for now. We'll pick up after Thanksgiving. You guys rock on. Thanks a lot. Have a good Thanksgiving. Ciao.